Maureen. She lived in Malawi for 6 years, where she was the Senior Government Psychiatrist, developing community mental health services, embedding mental health in the primary care system, and halving the population of the mental hospital. Since then, she's provided consultant support to several mental health services in resource-poor countries. She currently works with 26 developing mental health services in the church hospitals in Uganda and contributed to the UK All-Parliamentary Group on Global Mental Health. Maureen teaches mental health for resource-limited countries on the Liverpool, London and Glasgow Diploma courses in tropical medicine and tropical nursing, similar courses in Copenhagen, and global mental health for medical students in Newcastle. She's also visiting professor of international mental health at the University of Chester, UK. Maureen is part of Jamie's Fund, which supports mental health service development in Uganda, and you can find more details of that at jamiesfund.org.uk. Over to you, Maureen.
Thank you very much. A very warm thank you to Will. It's lovely to be here. I think Will actually deserves a few points for bravery, because he and I met when I was an inpatient at Walton Hospital in Liverpool, and he fairly recently examined my cranial nerves and then asked if he could have my email. I thought that was pretty good for a medical student. So Will, that was very nice of you to give me this invitation, and I am very pleased to be here. You've asked me to talk about being my career in global mental health. I think the first thing to say about that is I think that is possibly the best career anybody could have. I've had extraordinary experiences along the way, and what I'd like to do is to tell you in a very small amount of detail how I got to be the Senior Government Psychiatrist in Malawi and how I came to be working in Uganda. But I'd also, along the way, like to introduce you to some of my patients and my colleagues in those places who've been very important to me. Can't move that on now. Story so far is begins with the influences in my childhood, which was quite strongly. The church was quite strongly implicated, because the church my family belonged to had a great vision for world mission. This is going back a long way, obviously, and I heard lots of stories from medical missionaries who were doing astonishingly pioneering work in extremely poor countries, and I listened to these stories with rapt attention, and my favorites were always the stories from Africa. I also read a series of books called Jungle Doctor, and I watched Emergency Award 10, which was a precursor television program that was way before Casualty and Holby City and all the rest of it. So my scene was set, if you like. I was going to be a jungle doctor. I was going to work somewhere really tough and pioneering, probably in West Africa. So I went off to medical school and did my student elective in Nigeria, which was the Africa dream come true. It was exactly as I expected it to be. But don't forget, I was preparing to be a jungle doctor. And one of the things I remember very vividly is that most of the wards were commendably clean, and a little breeze came through in the heat of the day, except for one ward, which was set apart from all the others, was a hut with no windows and a lock on the outside. And that's where they kept the people with mental illness. And it was so radically different, so separate, so stigmatized, that it struck me, even then when I wasn't even thinking about psychiatry as anything like a career possibility. And that was an important part of the story, really. That kind of hit me, the way people with mental illness were being treated. And I knew that wasn't unusual. I was still keeping to the plan, doing the diploma in tropical medicine in Liverpool, as it happens, when my mother was diagnosed with a serious neurological illness, and her mother and sister also fell ill. And it didn't seem a very good idea to go trolling off to somewhere in the depths of Africa if they all were likely to need some help. I trained for general practice, and I came to the old Diva Mental Asylum in Chester to do my 6 months in psychiatry. And I've never stopped, because psychiatry captivated me in that the patients I met had such stories to tell. Psychiatry was at a very exciting time then. We're going back a very long time, and the science, the new science of neurochemistry, biochemistry, psychology, neuroanatomy. We were finding places in the brain which you could match up with auditory hallucinations, and so on. And the neuroimaging tools were coming on side, and so this seems quite an exciting time of development. And we were beginning to empty the asylums, the old asylums that had stood for so long as great bastions of institutionalized treatment to keep people safe. And the stories that the patients told just took my heart, really. And I became fascinated, as many psychiatrists are, with psychosis. What is it that brings about those signs and symptoms that make people behave so differently from their normal selves? And I've never lost that fascination. And I studied for my professional exams in an era when psychopathology was very much to the fore, and we did a huge amount of detail, which I loved. I thought that was fantastic. I made my way through then and became a consultant psychiatrist. First job was at Walton Hospital, where I've recently been an inpatient myself. And it was during the very early months of my new consultant post that a completely unexpected development occurred. And that was that Ewan, who's now my husband, walked onto the stage of my life. And extraordinarily, he was a man who was on his way to Africa. Because he'd grown up in Kenya, done his elective in Botswana, and anybody who had any thought of marrying him would have to be prepared to go to Africa as well. And by this time, my family problems had more or less sorted themselves out. And extraordinarily to me, and probably to him as well, we did fall in love. We got married and applied to British Aid to go and be useful somewhere in the world. And they said, would you like to go to Malawi? And we said, yes, that's fine. And then we went home and looked up Malawi, because neither of us knew anything about it. So we set out on this great adventure. We found as many people as we could who would tell us something about Malawi. So we learned about boreholes and wells from a young water engineer. We learned about geological formations from a geography lecturer. And we learned about how road traffic accidents were the greatest killers on the health scene in Malawi in those days. That was our briefing from the friends that we had. British Aid wanted us to go to Malawi because there was a vacancy for a psychiatrist. And psychiatrists had come and gone. No psychiatrist had actually finished a contract. The only Malawian who had trained in Germany, and halfway through his contract, he, as the story goes, ran off into the sunset with somebody else's wife. I probably wouldn't have looked at the job had there been Malawians to take it, but there weren't. In those days, there were many vacancies for psychiatrists and certainly for neurologists in low-income countries, because psychiatry was of no interest, of no matter, of no consequence. If you didn't have a psychiatrist, it's all right. Just put them in the mental hospital, they'll be fine, as long as they're taken away from public view. And it was the same story as I'd seen in Nigeria. Put them into the asylum, and that's all you need to do, because then they're off, out of the way, away from public view. I still found patients with fantastic stories to tell, and although the content of their stories were different, the form was just the same. So I could recognize major depression, mania, bipolar, paranoid psychosis, schizophrenia, just the same form as I was used to. So I could recognize that, even if the content was different. And that's one of the things that I learned in looking after. I wasn't looking after the mental illness of 10 million people. I was looking after the people who presented as seriously disturbed enough to be locked up in the mental hospital. Here we are, it's the Zomba Mental Hospital. Zomba is where we lived. Beautiful, beautiful town on the slopes of Zomba Plateau, which is brilliant. If you wanted time out, a day away or a weekend away, just take the Land Rover and whip up the mountain to one of the cottages up there. But down in the mental hospital, it was like our old asylums. You can see the photo there with shiny painted corridors and very high windows. And here's the stats. We had not only 10 million Malawians, but 1.5 million Mozambican refugees, 1 psychiatrist, 1 large mental hospital, 1 small psychiatric ward in the capital. There was no neurologist then. And there you are, you've got more than twice as many patients in the 212 beds. And in acute male, which could be pretty disturbed, there were about 90 patients. Throughout Malawi, though, there were 24 district hospitals, with 1 psychiatric nurse per hospital, most of whom were running maternity or outpatients or medical wards. The registered nurses stayed in the cities where they usually were following their husband's job. And our transport was 2 rehabilitated Land Rovers. I wondered if those of you who are listening would like to think what questions you would ask if you were faced with this particular setting. If you'd like to pop some chat answers to that and send them up to Will, let me know if any come in, Will.
Yes, we've got a couple here. The first question is, how do you prioritise?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, what's the next question?
So we've got, what was the threshold for admission? What was patient insight like? Was it a lot of responsibility for you personally?
Great. That's a great selection. What I'm wondering is, if it was you, what information would you like? I'll answer those questions though. It was a lot of responsibility, but I had brilliant colleagues who were very experienced. I had huge support from the Ministry of Health. I had to report directly to the Chief Medical Officer. There was nobody between me and him, and he was desperate to get more development going in the mental health service, because the World Health Organization was holding a bag of money which they were ready to send to Malawi as soon as there was a psychiatrist properly in post. And the level of insight was as variable as it is I've found anywhere in the world. It's just the same as it is here. For some, not bad. For others, absent. The level of responsibility, we'll maybe ponder on that one, because actually 11.5 million potential patients. I said to one of my student groups, I couldn't possibly look after all those potential patients. And somebody in the audience said, slacker. And of course you can't. But in fact, we did change things. And I think that's the point. One of the great kind of bywords in psychiatry is get to the person early in the illness if you can. And how are you going to do that? You're not going to do that by sitting waiting in the mental hospital for them to come in, because the threshold was that the patient was usually quite disturbed, agitated, talkative, not sleeping, running away, and the families would bring them in because they knew they'd get care in the mental hospital securely and safely. Unless they were cannabis users, the cannabis users quite often had been using for a long time. They were very good at climbing up. They would tear away some of the tiles on the ceiling, get into the roof space, run down the perimeter wall and run down to the market to get some more cannabis. They were very good at that. If you were faced with that as a system, this is the system for looking after the mental health of a nation. Is there any other way you could do it? That was at the point of my question, really. What would you need to know if you wanted to change things. Any answers to that, Will? Anybody asking any other questions?
So Helen's asking, was there a model for community mental health?
No, none at all. Because the Malawi government had done extremely well in training several cadres of enrolled psychiatric nurses, very basic level nurses, and they'd done that very well indeed. They were great nurses, some of the best I ever worked with. But they had no model for doing anything except referring patients to the mental hospital and sometimes following up the patients when they were discharged, but they'd be quite lucky to do that. So all they ever did was refer patients, nothing else.
How much funding was available?
Funding, it's quite hard to compare it with these days, because the budget was about £136,000 for the mental health of the nation, which wasn't very much really. And it certainly isn't very much now.
Certainly not. How can you, or can you, start an education program, recruit more psychiatrists?
Ah, excellent. No, there's no more psychiatrists, because they tried for years to get psychiatrists to stay, and quite horrible things had happened to some of them. Some of the Malawians, they didn't have a medical school at the time. I was there for the beginning of the medical college, and that was very exciting. But they had no Malawian doctors who could be sent for specialist training. There was just one who'd gone to Kenya for training, and he had died in a fire in his flat. And he wasn't the only one to whom harm had come. So I'm not making any comments about that, but you do have to think quite carefully when you're in a completely different culture about what might be going on. There was a very senior nurse who ran the hospital superbly. It was very, very good. It was the cleanest government hospital in the land, and it always smelt good. It smelt of a very strong disinfectant. And they did things like have a competition on Friday mornings for the best decorated ward. So the patients were practically standing by their beds, having hung the bougainvillea blossoms around where the curtains were normally pulled. Any other questions that you would? Yeah.
Questions about staffing here. There was a question about nurses, how many were available, and are there local people who'd be willing to be trained?
Excellent question. Yeah, we could have trained more nurses. Don't forget, you've got about 25 nurses in the district hospitals, which all had programs of going out to the health centres to do clinics in things like TB, there were antenatal clinics, orthopedics, general medical, and so on. That was all happening, but it seemed that nobody ever thought that you could do that with psychiatry and epilepsy as well. Yeah, are there other questions?
Yeah, so what about, we talked about staff, so what about the community? So how do you go about educating lay people on mental illness?
Brilliant. It's absolutely along the right lines. If you just stay in the mental hospital, just stay in the institution, how is the world to know that this could be different? So absolutely thinking outside the box, how could we change the way people think that mental health treatment should be carried out? Yeah, great question. Yeah.
And in terms of the government's perspective, what was their goal? Was it just to cure people, or was it to keep them away?
The government's perspective, I think they twigged that I was not likely to carry on sitting in the mental hospital. And we had great support from British Aid at the time, who were very keen to develop a community mental health service. And because of that, and because they knew the World Health Organization money was ready and waiting, and British money was ready and waiting, they were ready to go for it. Yeah.
So someone said psychoeducation within the medical fraternity. So that's kind of retraining. Is that possible as well?
Yeah, I think we're going to come to that when we come to Uganda, which is quite a long way on. So if we may, I'll move on. I would suggest that it's worth knowing what the patients and their families know that is different from what you know. And that will be about the content of their thinking and their emotional life when they become mentally ill. Because for most of them, they will know in the way that we know about the biology and the psychology of our patients. They know that this behavior is due to demon possession or witchcraft or angry ancestors. And if that's the knowledge that the patients and their families have, why would you go to a hospital anyway? How can things change if that's the belief, the local traditional knowledge? We'll come back to that, I'm sure. So what did I learn from that particular stretch at the mental hospital? First, the very different people we were dealing with, not just people who were a different nationality in terms of white Anglo-Saxon or local Malawians, but there were many other expatriate folks. This is in the days where a lot of expatriate folk went to help for a while, not to be immigrants in a Malawian community, but to help because resources were so low. And so we watched different nationalities, we watched different personalities to see how they got on mixing with each other, and discovered from, actually we discovered from the various missionary orders from the Catholic churches in those days about personality type. And I would strongly recommend you have a think about that, and I can give you more information about that by email if you want. So knowing yourself and that other people are different and not wrong. And then establishing those relationships. My first task was to establish relationships with the senior nursing staff, particularly the one senior nurse who'd been in charge. And we had very interesting time making that happen. But I had some great colleagues. Understanding others and understanding the local culture, I think, is absolutely crucial. And I'm still learning, even now, all these years later. We've already suggested, don't focus just on the individual patient. Don't think you have to do all the clinical work yourself. Look at the system, see how it could be different. And then you're there partly, your being there is partly an encouragement to your colleagues, not in this particular case of plunging into the mental hospital to take it over, but actually enabling them to feel very valued and worthwhile, and that we can work together on this. There'd been quite a history of expats trying to make a difference at the mental hospital, and I wanted this to work for the sake of the patients. Coming back home after our 6 years, when we did change the system, was a reverse culture shock. Changing the system had meant getting to know those enrolled psychiatric nurses, getting them into the local system of each district, so that they could go out too with the primary care and community teams and set up local clinics close to home. I knew it would work. Even I was surprised at how quickly it worked, because within 2 years, the number of patients, you remember there were 212 beds, within 2 years, the number of patients had gone down to 220, more than half. It was a bit of a surprise, but that's because those enrolled nurses now knew what they were to do. They were to take care of patients close to home. And some of the nurses that I met, I have to say, were absolutely superb, just wonderful. Now, when we came home, I'm going to tell you 2 stories from a couple of very different countries. I had a lot of fun, and I think the stories are very interesting too. A Welsh obstetrician invited me to go to Kyrgyzstan, and here it is. It's one of the stans. This is old Soviet Russia, and you can see how close. I was in Bishkek. I was quite close to China. We had people on the streets of Bishkek who were such a mixture of tall Slavs and short Mongolians from the steppes. Wonderful people. I had one word of Russian, and that was "niet," because this was a very short assignment. I didn't plan to stay. That wasn't the nature of the assignment. And it's important to remember my one word of Russian. To go out onto the streets of Bishkek, if I wanted to go out by myself, it's built on a grid, so I just had to keep turning right, and then I knew I would arrive back in the flat where we were staying. I wouldn't have been able to ask the way otherwise, but we managed perfectly well. Our task was to support a teaching program, which was to improve OBS and gynae for general practitioners and hospital staff in Bishkek and the surrounding areas. Olive, my colleague, had realized that nobody ever looked at the psychological aspect of anything in OBS and gynae. And we discovered that the method of contraception offered to the women of Kyrgyzstan and the other stans was termination of pregnancy. When a woman decided she couldn't manage another pregnancy, she would say, I can't have this pregnancy. So they'd say, okay, we'll take it away. They took it away and that was it. Nothing else. When Olive and I began to talk with them about the impact of that process on women's lives, I would say fully 2/3 of these members of staff, who were nurses, doctors, psychologists, obstetricians, fully 2/3 of them were weeping because they had lost babies to termination and nobody had said a word about it. Now that was a revelation, that you could run a whole health service without ever giving a thought to the patient's emotional reactions. I met, I got to know our 2 interpreters, and through one of them, who invited us to her home for dinner on 2 occasions, I met her mother, my Kyrgyzstani granny. And Kyrgyzstani granny was deputed to look after me while Olive and Irina made the dinner. And granny had no English. And you remember my 1 word of Russian. So "niet" doesn't get you very far in conversation. So she talked in Russian, I talked in English, and we got on really well. I just smiled when she smiled, essentially. When it came to the dinner table, I said to, after the chatting went on, I said to Irina, Granny was asking me through Irina, it was translated now, about my work. And at that stage, I'd done quite a bit of forensic psychiatry. So I'd worked with some really seriously disturbed people, quite a lot of poisoners for one thing. And Granny was asking really interesting questions. I said to Irina, what did your mother do before she retired? She said she was a forensic toxicologist with the KGB. And so she was a poisons expert with the Russian Secret Service. And she was an inspector of the secret chemical weapons factories under the earth in Russia. We say you never know. You never know about somebody's story unless you ask the questions. I loved my Kyrgyzstani granny. The other country I wanted to visit before we come to Uganda is Bangladesh, where again I was invited to help support the development of a mental health service. And the story I'm going to bring you from Bangladesh is about understanding the local culture. I noticed there was a hugely excessive suicide rate in the area where we were. Bangladesh was a bit exciting at the time because they were shooting at white people, but it was fine. We just had to be a bit careful, and we did get a police escort out. But I took the opportunity to talk to all the staff groups in the hospital, a very, very fine hospital. I think we've got, this is just the local people. I wanted to find out views of mental illness, how it should be treated and so on. I discovered that here, as around the world, people with mental illness are set apart, stigmatized, often beaten, and so on. But here in Bangladesh, they're quite likely to dig a pit and put you in a pit and beat you when you're down the pit as well. So it was a bit stark, really. But why this suicide rate, high suicide rate? Every staff group I asked accepted the rate was high and said, no, that's because of disappointment in love. Now, I was a bit, as a modern Western woman, I was a bit puzzled by this. If you're disappointed in love, find somebody else. No, not that. Don't make assumptions. If a boy and a girl, after the girls reached menarche, when she started having her periods, if a boy and a girl show interest in each other, that is a possibility of harm to the family's honour and must be dealt with. So they find a husband for the girl, this little girl, and in the dowry system here is that the family pays the prospective husband to take the girl away, and then she's married, and then she's safe. The family's honour is safe. If, as a result of being married to often an older man, and there'll be his mother as well, mother-in-law, if a girl is unhappy in that situation because her job is just to produce sons, if she then becomes depressed and kills herself, then that Everybody told me that is better than that the family honour should be shamed by a relationship between her and a boy. Now, I hear lots of very interesting things as a psychiatrist, but that one really did, well, it upset me apart from anything else. And the person, I got a tailor to make me 2 sets of local clothing, and his wife had killed herself 6 weeks previously, which brought it home very smartly. Don't make assumptions about culture. Don't assume you know how people will behave and what their priorities will be. Ask them. Everybody has a story, as I've just illustrated. Cultures are different. Don't expect them, the other, to think the same as you. Don't forget to ask questions. And so, much more to tell you about all of those countries, but let's get on to Uganda. The community trust I worked with up until when I retired for the 3rd time is Cheshire and Wirral Community Mental Health Trust, where I was a very happy community mental health team psychiatrist there and a continuing medical manager. Helen has reminded me I was originally a clinical tutor, or I don't know what we called it then. Was it a clinical tutor? Can't remember. Responsible for the postgraduate training. I had a lot of fun with a colleague doing that. Helen's reminded me the important thing was the lunches. The 3rd thing I did was work in the education team, and that was absolutely brilliant. I've had such a fascinating career, but it got even better, even more varied. Director of Nursing wanted to set up a link with a developing country mental health service, and off we went. Our Director of Nursing, Avril, a psychologist, Linda, and I went off to a church hospital in southwest Uganda where there was already a mental health service. Do you know, I think that probably wasn't the right thing to do, because they already had a mental health service. Nobody had asked us to go there. We went because Chester, our next door acute trust, already had a link, and it seemed like a good thing to do. Let's add mental health to what was already happening. But nobody had asked us to do that. They weren't requesting any help. They were, as always, hugely welcoming. Loved having us, but do you know, I don't think they needed us really, and things have changed a lot with Jamie's fund. We set up a link, began to establish the possibility of regular visits, and on a visit in 2011, little Jamie, who was then 4, came with us. He was the small son of Avril, became sick practically the minute we arrived, probably took the bug with him, and subsequently died aged 4. Avril and Jim wanted Jamie to be remembered, as if any of us would ever forget him. I miss him still, and this is 2011. Jamie's fund began as their memorial to him, and they wanted him to be remembered in Uganda as well as by all his friends in UK. And so we did set up, first of all, a new mental health ward. And I tell you this, folks, people with mental illness in low-income countries never, ever, ever get priority. They don't get the nice buildings. They don't get good facilities. They don't often get doctors working with them. This ward has replaced the old second-hand or third-hand ward that they were in. This is Jamie's ward. This is the finest ward in the hospital with the best view in the hospital, which the patients chose. The patients helped us orientate the whole thing. And it's got the best toilets in the region, which says a lot, because sometimes the toilets are pretty horrible. So there's Jim and Avril with the Principal Secretary, Dr. Atwine, Sister Nancy, who was running the mental health service, and on her left, Dr. Sheila, who ran the mental health service in Uganda at the time. A very, very happy day when we launched the new ward. The patients love it, enormously grateful for it. But I have to ask, as a result of experiences in Uganda, do you know where your patients are? If you're working in a low resource country, if there are traditional beliefs that keep the patients somewhere else, do you know where they are? I would ask you, always ask that. Where are our patients if you're working in mental health? Now, come with me. We're going now to the Ruwenzori Hills. Long, very interesting road to a small dark hut. And stepping inside, let me introduce you to James. James, history of mental illness, probably schizophrenia for many years. 3 stays in the big mental hospital in Kampala. 3 times came home well on medication, didn't know what to do when the medication ran out, so he relapsed. The family couldn't afford to keep going 8 hours journey there and back. So they chained him by a chain to the corner of the room. He became ill in his mid-20s. He's now 42. He's been there 15 years. That's James, who I got to know well. Sister Nancy here showing you all the shackles, the chains that have been removed from patients who they have found when somebody else has told them where to look. In the Horn of Africa, you will find patients being chained, as you will in many parts of the world. They're chained because people don't know what to do. And in the Horn of Africa, you may also find a hyena has been put in to bite away the demons, because that's what the people know is the cause. Sophia, my lovely friend Sophia, she's kept at home. On this particular occasion, she had a relapse of her bipolar illness, and the ladies of the church took her home when she became quite excited, and left her at home for her husband to look after her. He came home, was very angry that she was ill again, so he tied her with ropes, and you can see the scars, and tied her to the bed. Then he walked out, locking the door. I asked Sophia if it's okay to take her photograph and tell her story. And she said, oh yeah, oh yes, you must tell them. And this is one of those areas where I would ask you not to make assumptions that everybody wants their story kept confidential. Because every time I have asked for consent to show a photograph, to tell a story, the patients have looked at me in some bewilderment. Yeah, of course. If it's going to help somebody else, of course you've got to tell them. And Sophia specifically said, you must tell them. Tell them what it's like for us here. So I do. Sophia was rescued by her next door neighbour, and who'd rung Sophia's brother, and they were taken to the mental hospital, to the psychiatric ward in Kisizi, where I met her a day or 2 after admission. She was doing great. One lovely lady. You might find your patients not just in a dark hut, shackled. You might find them roped up at home. You will certainly find them with the traditional healers, because that's where you would go with those causes of mental illness that we've been discussing. And most of your patients will have gone there before they ever come anywhere near Western medicine. Or they might go to a private doctor so-called in the cities. And I would probably have some doubts about the qualifications for people running some of the medical centres. Some of them are very good, obviously, and indeed the church hospitals are private hospitals, but not all of them. I remember one lady who came in with pain in her face, and her father had sent her to this particular hospital because he'd run out of money for paying private doctors. The last one had said she had a nutritional deficiency in her teeth. He decided that from an x-ray, and she needed lots more medication. I think of a Chinese variety, I'm not sure. It only took 2 or 3 questions to establish her diagnosis of depression. You might find your patients in asylums, which may or may not be of good quality, usually not. In Indonesia, at this stage, patients, as you can see, are severely malnourished, shackled, and behind this patient in the foreground, you can see a pair of feet, because that's another patient behind. I'm very happy to say that things in Indonesia are improving. You might find your patients in prison. Most of our patients struggle to make a living, and unless we can change things for them, they will continue to struggle. So you may well find them on the rubbish heaps, trying to literally to scratch a living. And in this particular case, there is a small hospital, St Stephen's, which is a small hospital with very big ambitions. They serve the urban poor. They've got many very poor patients who scratch a living from rubbish heaps and similar. They do a fantastic work. And now they're doing a fantastic work in mental health as well. You might find your patients with psychiatric illness in the general hospital, because people with mental ill health, as you've already heard from Helen, many have serious physical illness which gets neglected. And just to mention for people with learning disability, I don't know if you've heard in the news about the furore which Joe Wiley has highlighted about how people with learning disability are way down the priority list for their corona vaccine. Or you might find your patient in the coffin 15 to 20 years earlier than people without mental ill health. Making a difference then, establishing and maintaining equal relationships, I think, is one of the great challenges, because if you come from a foreign country with the money to pay for a plane journey, you're obviously very rich. And if you've got the money, you've got the power. And to enable equal relationships takes a lot of hard work. Big tip, make friendships with people who understand where you're coming from and ask them to help you understand what life is in the country where you're working. And if in our case, in Jamie's fund, we found out from our colleagues what they wanted to do in terms of developing mental health services. We had such a fabulous time. We were already working with all the Protestant church hospitals. We asked the Catholics, are you interested in this at all, or is it not one of your things? And they said, yes, please come and see us. So we went to see the Catholic Medical Bureau, and they said, we had one of our review services. We said, one of our priorities for this next 3-year span was mental health, but we didn't know what to do. So we would really like you to help us. So find out what they want and work in partnership with them. Almost certainly training will be involved. Jamie's fund has been having a whale of a time getting people trained, those very few people with mental health qualifications, getting them trained in Mental Health Gap, which is a World Health Organization program. When they're trained, out they go to train their non-psychiatric colleagues to deliver much better care to people with mental illness and epilepsy. Because there are many more general trained staff wherever you go than there are mental health staff. This is our wonderful group of our first group of students. In the centre is Joshua, bending down. At the working party of the Parliamentary, all-party Parliamentary group on global mental health, I met a wonderful professor from Uganda, whose name I've known for a long time, Professor Fred Kigozi, and said, I'm hoping you can point me in the direction of somebody who could help us with training in MHGAP. And he said, yeah, him. And he pointed to Joshua. Joshua's become a wonderful friend to Jamie's fund. He does our MHGAP training. And these young people that you see on this screen here were the pioneers. These were the first ones to do their MHGAP training. They've now trained several hundred general staff in mental health. And we're moving on to do community education, learning from each other across cultures, sharing good practice. They love getting together, working to influence minds and change attitudes. Find the enthusiasts. That's another tip, another thing I've learned. On the right, Cooley, brilliant brilliant leader of a mental health service embedded in community development in Bwindi Community Hospital. The lady in pink is the midwife, who's the senior clinician at a rural health centre. And then next to her is a young man, a general clinical officer, who's done his MHGAP training and has absolutely loved it. And next to him is the most wonderful enrolled nurse, who told me that he was very, very keen to learn more so that he could do his specialist training. Then he would get married, age 32, and have 2 children. He was very sure about it. And this team, for me, exemplify what happens when you find the enthusiasts, the people who've really got the vision, who want to make a difference, and then you work with them, support them, give them a bit of money. Remember James? James locked away in the darkness for 15 years. 6 months after I met James, when I met James, he was very thought disordered, couldn't talk intelligibly at all, except when I said, "What can I do to help you, James?" He said, "Can you get me some food?" So I said, I thought we might be able to organise that. And then as I was just leaving, I said, "James, what can I do? Is there nothing I can do to help you?" He said, "Yes, get me an injection." Now, I think because he'd been in the big mental hospital, he knew that an injection might help. So the local team, who then began to work with James and continued to do so, ensured that he was physically fit, got him an injection, and 6 months later, James walked out into the sunshine and told me about his hopes and dreams for the future. And every time we go now, I pop up and see James. He's doing brilliantly. And he's not the only one. Cooley, the mental health lead, helped to make this poster, which the team wanted to make: community mental health. Permanent incarceration of the mentally sick will soon be over in Bwindi Community Hospital catchment area. The over is made of shackles, which have been taken away from people because they don't need them anymore. Final introductions, and this I think is the end. Sister Nancy, top right, who led the mental health service in Kasese for many years, a wonderful clinician. Next to Granny, whose son killed himself because he was shackled at home for so many years, and whose grandson's psychosis is now being successfully treated. Granny's so thrilled with Julius's progress that as we visited, she plunged into the vegetable patch and plucked a cabbage for us to take back to Kasese. There's Cooley again, and with him is Edsa, who's a village health volunteer. She's had basic training in spotting people with mental ill health and epilepsy, as well as people with general medical problems. Cooley had contacted her to say, "We're all coming up a week on Thursday. Can you find all those people you think might have mental illness or epilepsy?" And she found 42. Never been seen before. And there's James. These folk represent the wonderful staff that we work with in Jamie's fund, the families, the patients, and the volunteers, all crucial. I haven't mentioned Florence. Florence was kept in a storeroom with no ventilation and no lighting for a year before the team were alerted to the fact that she was locked away in the darkness. They got to know her, put her on treatment, and today Florence's smile lights up a room. Making a difference has to be one of the great excitements for any clinician, and perhaps most of all in psychiatry, where families have lost their relatives, they've changed so much. And to restore people to not only to health and mental health, but to bring them to the stage where they can no longer be what they're often thought of as useless, but to bring them back to where they can work on the family's farm or even set up with small businesses of their own, is one of the most dramatically satisfying things I think a clinician can do. I've given you information there about Jamie's Fund. By all means, have a look, see what we're doing. And then my email. After all these years, since I was going to be a jungle doctor, I've left out almost all of it. I've given you just a glimpse of a career in global mental health. I think you might understand that I do strongly recommend it. Will, have I got time for one more story?
Yeah, go for it.
After we'd returned home from Malawi, an American friend of ours said that she thought we were mentioned in a book by an up-and-coming young politician who was standing for Senate, I think. And she said it was when the two of us, Ewan and I, were working in Uganda. And well, we've never worked in Uganda. Ewan grew up there, but we've never worked in Uganda. So we said, no, I don't think so. And she emailed back and said, no, I think it probably is you. The details do fit. So we thought, oh, that's a bit weird. And I asked a friend if I could borrow the book, and she popped it through the letterbox. She actually gave it to us. The thing was, you see, we hadn't heard the surname of the person who was telling a story of how he met us in Kenya. And I found the chapter on Kenya, chapter 17. And the first name I saw was Alma. Oh, yep, this is us, 1988, on safari in Kenya. With us were an Italian who'd never seen any lions in Kenya in spite of several visits. So we found him some lions. And a young couple who'd grown up in a separated family. So they'd grown up in different places. And they were getting together to try and put their stories together, really, of their family connection. Well, as I say, we didn't know, we didn't remember the surname particularly, but the person, I hope you can see him. Oh, that looks inside out to me. But in fact, the surname was Obama. And we had been camping around the campfire and gazing at the stars with, I'm sorry, I only knew him as Barry Obama. You see, you never know. Ewan and I thought, as we chatted to them, him and his sister, around the campfire, what bright and thinking young people they were. But we never guessed where he'd end up. And you don't know, the people you meet, those who might not seem to have any particular future ahead of them, the refugees, the asylum seekers who've already got a future behind them. Many of them, many of the patients we meet all over the world may well have such potential. Who could resist that? Okay, questions? There's quite a lot, I think.
Thank you so much for that. That was just great. So interesting to hear about so many different places, and I can't believe you're going to leave that story out. Brilliant, yeah, and some great tips for students there, and I think people at all levels probably find some of the things that you suggested quite useful. Any questions, guys, feel free to put them in the chat. I believe Helen is still here as well. If you've got anything specifically for either Maureen or Helen, then let us know. I wanted to ask you something. I think you've kind of made a bit of a theme throughout this about mental health not being a priority in many of these places.
Yeah.
Do you think it will or could become more prioritized in the way that seems to be happening in countries like the UK? Do you think that is something which could happen?
Yes, I do. One of the lovely things about the way Jamie's Fund's working now, if you look on the website, look for the Jamie's Fund model and you'll see how we do it. We work in partnership not only with the two boards of the Protestant and Catholic medical bureaus, but also directly with the Ministry of Health. Now, working in Malawi, I had influence and power reporting directly to the Chief Medical Officer. Working in Uganda, I was a bit sad that I didn't have that way of influencing anymore, but in fact I do, because working with the Ministry of Health and encouraging them is where it makes a difference. So this is about seeing the big picture and creating a big vision. Dr. Hafsa is the lead for mental health, and she's only a lead, she's not a minister or a Secretary of State, but for mental health, who is very eager to develop community mental health services. And I think we can do it if we do it together. Because she'll need help with the training. And everywhere we go, we provide encouragement. Now, I think that will roll on. just as our lovely young colleagues have become so enthusiastic about their MHGAP training, and we're going to do community education. Tell you what, there's a brilliant medical director in a city centre hospital, church hospital, just outside Kampala, where he is the lead for the mental health service development. And every Sunday, a team from the hospital goes out to the local churches, because you will find, that's where you will find the people. Uganda is a very religious country on the whole. You will find people in the churches. That's a great place to catch them. They've got the ministers on board. After the morning service, they get a little talk on mental illness. And now there is a steady stream of people coming. Things are changing. Yes, you can do it, but you need people to be advocates.
Speaking of being an advocate, I guess we've got a couple of questions here about how you get into global mental health. So Praveen Kumar has asked, for the psychiatry trainees in the UK interested in global mental health, please may we know the recommended courses or training or routes to get into the field? Yeah,
there are diplomas in global mental health. The one I know about is Glasgow, but there are others. You can certainly do diplomas, and you can do masters in global mental health, which will be no, you can do a master's in global mental health. You can do a diploma in tropical medicine, which includes a day with me at the moment, though that may change. I don't know any easy way. I went because I got married. I mean, that's not a reason to recommend, really, is it? I'm jolly glad I did both things.
We've got some other questions here about career. So what would you say was your biggest personal challenge when starting? Was it isolation or biases or something else?
I haven't got that long to think, have I? I think it was the complexity of relationships, probably particularly in the big mental hospital in Zomba. But as visitors, warmly welcomed and loved by the majority of people that you meet, you can put your foot in it really so easily, and you can get things wrong if your perspective is wrong, if you haven't developed the insights, if you haven't got a good local friend who will tell you, don't do that. I think that's probably, and it's quite subtle, but I think that's what I would say. Yeah. So work at it. Find a friend who can tell you how we do things here. I don't mean here in UK. I mean here wherever they are.
And speaking of like native people, Trevona DC has asked, do psychiatrists have a role in practicing in developing countries, or should the focus be on training native people?
Well, I think I've answered that by telling you what we do in Jamie's fund. I don't do any clinical work unless I'm asked by local people. It's all local people who do the work. It's Joshua, who's a Ugandan psychologist, who is the main trainer, and he has several colleagues who help us. We work alongside if required, but mostly we're not. Mostly our Ugandan colleagues do the work and do it brilliantly. I said find the enthusiasts. You would not work in mental health in somewhere like Uganda or Malawi unless you really had a big heart for it. And if you can find those people, support them, and often they will need money and training, and we can do that. But yes, absolutely do it. Make sure it's local people who do it, because then you don't have a problem with the language. I mean, Uganda's got 15 dialects, and many other countries, but I think Malawi, I can't remember how many Malawi's got, but I couldn't possibly learn all of those to psychotherapy level, could I?
No, well, it'd be an impressive feat if you did. We're coming up to 8:30. I'm happy to ask you a few more questions, but it's getting quite late. So if you would like to leave, and maybe we can email some things over to you, Maureen, and if there's any for Helen as well, would you prefer to have those emailed to you?
I'm quite happy to stay on, and by all means email me. Love hearing from. I should warn you, I've already warned Will about this. I do tend to pick up medical students. we're still in a very happy touch with a medical student who is German, but we met her in Copenhagen, as you do. And there are other students who, some of them, have been with me to Uganda to meet my colleagues who do all the work and so on. But please email me if there are more questions, which there probably will be, because I've left more unanswered than answered, I think.
There's a couple more here that I think is sort of in reference to yourself specifically. So what's the best way to support mental health needs in low-income countries? Would you recommend going to live in this setting or staying in the UK and helping in other ways?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think you can do it either way. One of the great advantages of all our trainers being Ugandan is that COVID hasn't stopped it, because we've not been able to go to Uganda. But Joshua's carried on. Once lockdown was over, lockdown was horrible in Uganda. There was far more distress and disruption caused by the lockdown than from the COVID itself. It's really been bad. But as soon as it was possible for people to meet together, our Ugandan colleagues have been able to get on with it. And I think we've got about 20 applications in for the next phase of the training rollout. So you can do it from a distance. And if you want to email me for more details on how to do that, it will almost certainly be to support the supporting charities, I would think, rather than going and doing it yourself. See, I went to Malawi because there wasn't a psychiatrist. How can you leave a country without a psychiatrist? Anyway.
You have to start somewhere, don't you?
You do.
Have you ever worked on any mental health support projects focused on peer-to-peer support?
Yes.
Speak about your experience.
Yeah, there's a fabulous group in Uganda called Strong Minds Uganda, which is a women's group, and heartily recommend Strong Minds Uganda. Either email me or look it up on the web, and that's a peer-to-peer support group. We've had meetings with them in Kampala. They don't actually need us at all. They do it themselves, and they're brilliant. And then there were one or two others that I've encountered but not actually developed. I think they're great. When they work well, they're great. That must work with the refugees as well, Helen, doesn't it? No.
I'm not sure if Helen's still there. If she's got her, I can't see her myself, but she might. We'll just let her come in. I'm not sure if she's going to come through.
Okay.
If she does come through, we can go back.
Yeah.
Gina's asked, do you feel global mental health should be introduced into undergraduate mental health?
You're asking me that question? Yeah, I think that would be a very good idea. Yeah. To have an awareness that things are not, things are getting better in the UK, as Helen suggested. We've a long way to go. Just think how far many really poor countries have to go.
That's brilliant.
My sound went then.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
No, peer-to-peer support.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly in setting up services for asylum seekers and refugees, a lot of our services, we try to involve people in the actual setting up of the service, and then in peer-to-peer support and peer-to-peer projects. And I think those are the ones that are usually the most successful.
Yeah.
With a minimal input at the start, and then letting people use the skills that they've brought to the country to set things up themselves. It's always much more successful than us wading in.
Yeah, because then you get over the problems of language and culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because they know that stuff.
On the topic of culture and language and those sorts of things, is obviously such a big topic, and I feel like you could talk for, I'd love to ask you loads and loads of questions. One of the things I wanted to ask you both really in general was just about culturally relevant therapies and how those play into it. Obviously, Maureen, you mentioned things which are obviously not therapies or regarded as therapies, but certainly the way people are treated, putting them in chains, putting them in hyenas. But are there culturally relevant therapies like those involving religion, which are found to be effective? And if so, how much do you pay homage to those when you're working in different countries with different priorities and different views of mental health?
Very quickly, we are very cognizant of the fact that pretty much all our patients will also see traditional healers. Fine, no problem. unless they're poisoning the patients. And I have met 1 or 2 patients I've met one who went into renal failure, others who've had quite a tricky time because of toxic traditional herbs and so on. Often the traditional healers answers the questions that we can't. I can't tell you why the ancestors are angry, but the traditional healer will give you a satisfactory explanation. The other remedies, I've often thought, I strongly recommend finding a cultural, intercultural tool. If you email me, I'll give you some information on that, because we can divide societies in different countries on different parameters, like you can with personality. For example, individualist versus collectivist, and the collectivist societies do very well with group therapy. Some of our teams do interpersonal group therapy, for example, which works brilliantly. There are some of the hospitals we support have got alcohol support groups, brief interventions followed by joining a support group if you want to. They can join an AA group, because that's quite strong in Uganda, or if they don't fancy the AA model, they can follow the alternative group which has been set up for them. Yes, so there are other therapies. Helen, have you got
yeah, I was going to say the most, I think a lot of the therapies for people seeking asylum aren't very effective because of the situation that people are in when they try to do them. And I think I mentioned the Family Refugee Support Project, I think stands out as a therapy that I've seen working really well in really traumatized people, because often the people who come to us aren't used to the idea of sitting in a room with a stranger, telling them your deepest secrets. It's just not something that you do. So the Family Refugee Support Project, as I say, uses gardening and horticulture to create an environment where people talk and get to know each other, and support workers work alongside them, and they can bring their children and gradually talk to someone that they've begun to trust. They also use something called narrative therapy, which I was interested in because it was explained to me as having been devised so that it could be used anywhere, including a refugee camp or wherever you might be. And essentially all you really needed is some stones. And people are encouraged to tell their story and to mark out the story in a physical fashion, perhaps lining up stones to represent different elements of the story along the way, and to draw a kind of a map really of what the story is. And there's not a lot of psychoanalysis or anything to it. It is really just a way to bring the story and discuss it with somebody in a gentle way, come to terms with some elements of it. And I know they use that at Family Refugee Support Project. I mean, it's more complex than I've described, but it is, I think, quite a long way from what we might imagine would be the types of therapies that people are going to need, like eye movement desensitization therapies and all the types of other therapies we use for trauma. I think maybe have their place years later, but actually at the start, simple community-based, culturally aware therapies where people get to know their therapist as a person and work alongside them work so much better. You've had many people say, I mean, people in the UK say it as well, why would I want to tell my secrets to a stranger, but even more so a stranger in a new country whose language I don't share. Yeah, I think being inventive with how you do therapies is really important, and open to ideas.
And speaking of being open to ideas, I think, mate, it's the last question. We've got a question from Jed, who's on our committee as a second year rep. He says, are there aspects of practicing psychiatry in other countries that you think we can learn from in the West? Do you think there's elements that we could potentially incorporate into our own mental health system and practices?
Yes, I do. Avril, Jamie's mum, was particularly impressed, because she wasn't used to it, by how involved the families were, in that no patient would come into an inpatient stay without at least one member of the family coming in to look after them, and that helps to solve the resource problem because you haven't got enough nursing staff and so on, but also provides comfort for the patient. You have to watch it because you don't want, you know, a member of the family who is hostile to the patient, but a member of the family is crucial to the development of the patient's story, as well as helping to look after them in hospital. And none of our patients or their families would dream of the patient being seen alone unless there were very particular reasons like sexual trauma. So yes, bring the families in. So Avril started a campaign in Cheshire World Partnership then, get all the families in to do the nursing.
Interestingly, I used to work in Garston, and Garston was a place where I never saw a patient alone.
Yeah.
It's still a real community there. And I moved away then and noticed it when I moved. But whilst there, people would always come into an inpatient with, or an outpatient appointment with a family member.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's the collectivist outlook. Why would you leave the person alone with their family?
That's really, really fascinating. Yeah, I guess it reminds me a little bit of, I don't know if you see that more in old age psychiatry when you have people coming in with, you need to give a collateral history or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, really fascinating. Thank you both very, very much. I'm going to start to wrap it up.